bureaucracy takes over in 1953 when they overthrow Khwaja Nazimuddin and they establish the first hybrid system. Their thinking is that we will now establish a stable authoritarian system that will maintain the facade of a functioning parliamentary democracy. The Prime Minister asks his principal private secretary that, on which side is the civil service? And the reply he gets is the winning side.
Thank you very much, sir, for your time. And hopefully, we learn, especially the time in which Pakistan is. And today's conversation is actually based on your latest article on Pakistan's constitutional disorder and the role of the bureaucratic class. I would like to begin with what was the actual motivation behind writing this article, given that you've already done a massive work on Pakistan's institutional and historical context.
Well, if I'm being perfectly honest, there is a traditional practice at the university where you are expected to write at least one research paper every year as a proof of life, even after you've become a professor. So this is part of my proof of life effort, that once a year or twice a year I do still try to publish in journals. So that is what motivates me to then try to find things to write about. So if I'm being very honest, that's how I ended up talking about this subject in the paper. And of course, the subject itself is something which leads easily from my existing research on the Pakistani state, its culture of power, how it has evolved over time. And in particular, I was interested in looking at the specific way in which the civil service actually contributed to the creation of Pakistan's first hybrid regime, as we might call it, in 1953, and then how it has continued to function in a very predictable pattern almost since then in undermining constitutional democracy. So that's what I was interested in looking at, that how exactly did this process take shape. And when we look at the debates of the early 1950s and we look at today's debates about constitutionalism or democracy or the role of the bureaucracy or the role of the army in our politics and other such things, there is a very great overlap. So in a way, our history keeps repeating itself in 5 to 12, 13-year cycles, depending on what period you're looking at. So that's also something interesting that, how did our current situation start?
So, talking about the history, as in your previous work, The Culture of Power and Governance of Pakistan, what we get the sense is that Pakistan is actually in a continuity of the pre-colonial and the colonial culture of power, of arbitrary and idiocratic orientation of the state power, continued by the bureaucratic elite since the creation of Pakistan. Is it the historical determinism?
Well, I wouldn't say it's entirely deterministic, because in India, which inherited much of the same tradition of arbitrary rule, which experienced actually a longer and deeper exposure to the colonial Raj, the political elites after independence were able to consolidate constitutional democracy and transition India to being a remarkably stable democratic republic. Of course, when you look at the governance of India below the level of the constitutional process, you quickly see that their governance at a day-to-day level is nearly as arbitrary as ours. And many of the problems they face in terms of administration, in terms of corruption, in terms of abuse of power by government functionaries and elected representatives, the nexus between crime and politics in India is, I would say, as bad, if not even worse, than in Pakistan. So you then realize that, well, at the higher level, India is successful in consolidating and building upon the colonial era parliamentary and constitutional practices. And in the Pakistani context, we very quickly lose that veneer and we fail to consolidate, and we go back to a pattern of arbitrary rulership by essentially unaccountable government officials, bureaucrats at first, and then later on military officers and bureaucrats.
Well, Jinnah's vision of bureaucracy was very clear. He wanted them to be professional within the bounds of the law and to build a new state confronted with a lot of challenges, especially the migrations and the weak governance structures and the lack of institutions. So even the leadership of the Jinnah, was it not suffice to guide the country or the bureaucracy to the path of constitutionalism and law?
The thing about Jinnah is that he had engaged very specifically with the question of the civil services in India going back to, I think, 1911, 1912. And he had also engaged very consistently with the development of an Indian military officer class. So he was a member of the 1926 Indian Military Commission, which then leads to the creation of the Indian Military Academy. And in that context, Jinnah was clear that having a neutral, that is to say politically neutral, merit-based civil service elite and also military officer class were both things that were indispensable to the subcontinent and would be extremely important once that subcontinent gained independence. And then you could actually use the state machinery as an instrument of national development, which was, of course, not what the colonial state was interested in doing. They were not really interested on that front. But the assumption was that, well, once they leave, then you'll be also able to do that. So in the very brief time he had after Pakistan comes into existence of relatively good health, he again laid down what he thought should happen. But he simply passed away before that transition could be navigated. And his successors were again not able to carry that transition to a successful conclusion. So then these hierarchical institutions, starting with the civil service and the military, they gained in power. They became ascendant over the political class, over the elected element in the leadership. And once they became ascendant, they reconfigured Pakistan's political order into one where the political leadership or the political class as a whole is essentially used by the army and the bureaucracy for providing a appearance of political legitimacy from time to time. So I think, that transition, he simply did not have the time.
So Jinnah's absence obviously left a vacuum, later on to be filled by the military bureaucratic elite. But what I get impression from your article, which you have rightly mentioned, that in 1951 the provincial elections of Punjab were held, and there was a lot of electoral malfunctioning recorded, as you rightly mentioned in your article, by the 1956 election commission report. So was it the political elite collaborated with the civil bureaucracy, and or was it initially it was the military who started this unconstitutionalism or lack of rule of law? I mean, it's a rhetorical question, kind of, to who will actually be blame the bin. But as an historian, I would really appreciate your stance on this.
If we actually look at the specific process, then the 1951 Punjab elections are extremely important because this was the first time since independence that you were going to go to the polls. And it was also the first time that you would have had elections on the basis of one person, one vote. So they were the first universal adult franchise elections. And organizing the electoral machinery, making sure that it functioned smoothly, making sure that it produced a credible result, was something that was very much in the interests of not just the government, but the political class as a whole. And what we see is that in the context of those elections, the Muslim League government uses the police and civil service, not the army, the civilian bureaucracy, in order to manage the results in about 50 constituencies, according to the filings made by the High Court Bar Association. And those filings were also then accepted as being valid by the subsequent government commission on this subject. So that is again a very big contrast with what happens in India, where there is also a debate about how to manage the next elections, and Nehru essentially understands that Indian democracy will become legitimate not if the winning party is happy with the result, but if the losing party accepts that they have lost fair and square. And for that purpose, he gives India's first election commissioner, chief election commissioner, Sukumar Sen, essentially a free hand to organize the electoral system and to insulate the functioning of that electoral system from government interference at the critical stage of the initial scrutiny and campaigning, then at the actual voting day, and then in terms of the compiling and the announcement of the results. And the result is that in India, when the elections are held in 52 and then again in 57, acceptance emerges from the opposition to the Congress that the election itself has been fairly conducted. And in the Pakistani context, what we see is that the elections that are held, they then produce the by now very familiar story that the party who loses, or the candidates who lose, they allege government interference, heavy-handedness, state oppression, and in many cases they happen to be correct in making those allegations, though maybe some might also be wrong in making those allegations. And there is simply no credible machinery by way of election tribunals or any sort of autonomous process that can actually make a determination as to which allegation is true and which allegation is false. So the credibility of the entire exercise gets a big question mark put over it. So the impression that then emerges is that the political class is afraid of a actual democratic contest, and instead that element of the political class that is currently in government would very much like to use its influence over the administration to secure favorable results. So when you look at the report of the 1956 Electoral Commission, if you just blank out the dates, it can be describing the election that took place in Pakistan in 2024
or
2018, or take your pick, basically. The same things about candidates being pressured, about the police interfering, about accusations about the credibility of the voter roll, about the weakness of the powerlessness of the election tribunals to actually respond to any complaints that are filed by the opposition candidates. So all of that mess, if you will, is right there in 1951. So the Pakistani tragedy basically is that that element of your leadership, the political leadership and the civilian bureaucrats who had the greatest vested interest to set in motion a constitutional system in which they would naturally have the most power and the most authority, they drained that exercise of legitimacy. And that, of course, eventually sets the stage for not just an authoritarian system as emerged after 1953, but eventually a military dictatorship that emerges from that authoritarian hybrid in 1958.
So, talking about the 2024 elections or 2018 elections, as you rightly mentioned, that if we remove the dates, and it seems that the same culture or the same practices have been happening. But given the current debate in the society, a lot of young people who have not read the history maybe, or who do not have that much political exposure, and what they saw in 2013 maybe, or 18 or 24, so two questions which are very pertinent in the minds of the people. The one is कि जी हमारे ये जो इलेक्शंस हो रहे हैं, ये तारीख में पहली बार हो रहा है कि ये इस लेवल के ऊपर जो है व्हाट वी आर सेइंग. एंड नंबर टू, द सेकंड वर्ड केम इन माय माइंड वाज द हाइब्रिड regime which is being used nowadays frequently in Pakistan. And Professor Muhammad Wasim from the LUMS, he used this word for the regime established in 2018 to 2022. So how would we see that alongside the political class, the bureaucratic class has consistently maintained their collaboration with the power corridors, either to rig the elections or in order to maintain their arbitrary rule, given within the framework of the constitution, which we may call the hybrid regime?
Well, reference the research paper. I begin with a quote from the BBC comedy series, Yes, Prime Minister, in which the Prime Minister asks his principal private secretary that, on which side is the civil service? And the reply he gets is the winning side. So I think that has been the consistent, I wouldn't call it a policy, but I would say the consistent programming of the civil service, that at every point in time it has sought to align itself with whichever element it sees as being dominant. And that naturally has left it in a situation where it is the junior partner of the Pakistani military. And in the early years of this setup, 1953, 54, 55, you do see that the civil servants had standing that was more important than the military element of that regime. But after just a few years, the relative power of the military compared to the civil service asserted itself. So since 1958, essentially, the civil service is the junior partner of the military in these enterprises. And what is also interesting is that whenever you have the restoration of democracy or some form of elected rule, what happens is that at the field level, those who are at any point in time in the good books of the military leadership and therefore get a chance to be MNAs and MPAs or other important personalities in the government, they can essentially have an input to move the bureaucracy in order to serve whatever they think is important at a day-to-day level. And that gives them a very strong incentive to, of course, cooperate with the existing setup. But when it comes to the higher policy level or the big decisions, those, of course, remain in the hands of the military itself. So At a day-to-day level, there is a sort of political interference that goes with the system, wherein the political class does get to, use the bureaucracy in order to, punish its personal rivals or reward its supporters or undertake various projects that can help recover the cost of the election, or maybe even not more than that. So there is that element as well of this.
So it seems a kind of a moral collapse on the part of the bureaucratic elite. So actually, in Professor, what explains this behavior? Is it a institutional cowardice or a rational choice by the bureaucracy to survive within the power structure of Pakistan?
I think what happens is that when the bureaucracy takes over in 1953, when they overthrow Khwaja Nazmuddin and they establish the first hybrid system, their thinking is that we will now establish a stable authoritarian system that will maintain the facade of a functioning parliamentary democracy. And behind that facade of a functioning parliamentary democracy, the civil service will run the country, the army will serve its enforcer, and the political leadership, or the politicians more broadly speaking, they will, put on a good show for the public by way of having, governments and prime ministers and the whole, paraphernalia of a Westminster style setup. And they thought that, to use Cornelius's phrase, that they thought that we'll establish a governing corporation that will allow Pakistan to make sensible long-term policy decisions that the politicians are incapable of making. And this system will then guide Pakistan towards greater economic development and social stability, and ultimately it will become accepted as the norm of our system. What, of course, the bureaucrats did not quite realize was that they quickly found themselves sandwiched between two inescapable problems. The first problem that they faced was that no matter how obsequious, no matter how spineless somebody was in their eyes, once you put them on the throne as the prime minister, after a few months, they started getting annoyed with the way in which they were effectively cut out of the decision-making process. So, having a front man, as the case would be, proved to be something which was very difficult to manage, because when someone is sitting in the Prime Minister's office and constitutionally wielding the authority of the government, then having to perpetually kowtow before grade 22 officials, दोहाले को ज़माने में grade उस तरह नहीं थी, but federal secretaries or other senior civil servants
was obviously there.
Is very chafing. So even the most humble cipher would after a while become impossible to manage. This led to their replacement by somebody else. So the facade of this regime was extremely unstable. The second problem related to this was that it was also very difficult to manage politicians in the way that you can manage civil servants. The political class could be co-opted, and there were many people happy to join the king's party, as the case would be, but they would demand a price. So that price would often entail cabinet positions, it would entail contracts, it would entail policy favors, it would entail using the state machinery in order to secure their interests
or their financial
or their
interest.
financial interest or other such things. If you look at the early period, then there's so many reports of ministers in the government trying to get favorable allotments of evacuee property for themselves or for their relatives. And obviously, they needed the support of the civil service to do that. So that creates a very high amount of corruption in such a setup. So basically, the cost of running the facade starts to escalate. The second problem which the civil service faced was that once they had denuded the constitutional system of its vitality and its legitimacy, they were themselves riding a tiger in the form of the armed forces. And the demands of the armed forces for resources, for patronage, for other such things started to escalate dramatically. And it became impossible for the civil service to resist those demands. So, in a way, the civil service found itself between these two very, very difficult constituencies, neither of which it could effectively manage. And eventually, what of course happens is that the army effectively takes over and reduces the civil servants to a subordinate condition. So, whatever they might have thought in the early 50s or mid 1950s, it is clear that they did not have the kind of cunning or the kind of political sense to actually navigate what would be a very treacherous situation. So I think there was a failure in a sense of that judgment on their part, which was not evident to them at the beginning. But if you, let's say, look at Chaudhry Muhammad Ali's letter to the Constitution Commission of Ayub Khan, you realize that at that stage, at least the more perceptive members of this governing corporation had actually started to realize that we really messed up, that, we did something which was really wrong. And now there's really no way to undo those consequences because those consequences have assumed a life of their own.
So that means that the bureaucratic and the political elite, the huge hue and cry they make today that we are being sidelined and we do not have a space to work on. So actually, that is actually the result of what has happened over the course of the history, and which you have rightly mentioned that during Zia's era, it was actually the complete takeover by the military elite and the bureaucratic and the political elite just settled them with the new norm or the new reality of the day, and which continues till today.
Yes. So, the thing is that once you have had this kind of a constitutional breakdown and the military takes over, then the quality of political leadership that you need to restore civilian supremacy is extraordinarily high. So the trick is, of course, to get it right the first time so that you don't have to restore it. Because, once that path dependency is set, then that can continue for a very long time, as happened in India, for instance. But if you establish a bad path dependency, then breaking that and going towards a better one is extremely difficult. And that is, a challenge which none of our political leaders since the 1950s have really been able to rise to. And of course, the thing is that once the military gains that position in your internal system, it also has the ability to detect and preempt any moves to diminish its own standing. So it's not as if they are just going to peacefully wait for you to carry out your scheme. So, you have to again manage a very, very difficult situation. And it's very hard once this sort of breakdown occurs to undo it.
So, what sort of mindset or a morality we have developed that even the written constitutions or the so many constitutional promises or the so many constitutional and democratic slogans being used by the intelligentsia of this country or by the political elite of this country or the so-called the democratic elite of this country, is it just a bargain tool to get into the power, or the selective morality in order to deceive the public to get into the power to collaborate with the bureaucratic and the military elite?
I think in one sense, the challenge is that if the political class that has the most to gain from the consolidation of a constitutional system, if they don't believe in constitutionalism, it becomes very difficult to convince anybody else that this is something worthwhile. So the problem here is that whenever you're talking about any sort of constitutional consolidation, the onus of responsibility for that consolidation lies with the political class. And if that consolidation has gone wrong, as it did in our case, then that is a huge responsibility on their shoulders to try and find some way back to it. So this is something which obviously then has a demoralizing effect on the broader public, if you will. It leads to the development of a pervasive cynicism about the political process, about the electoral system, about casting your vote. So a normal response from a lot of citizens is that they then decide that, well, we'll become apathetic to this outcome. Like, what does it matter? That, whether you vote or whether you don't vote, whether you participate in politics, whether you don't participate in politics, whether you try to secure your rights under the law or you don't try to secure them. I mean, all of these exercises then appear to be wastes of time to most people. So this type of a setup, what it basically does is that it produces a large number of bad citizens. And the more bad citizens you have, the easier it is to have this sort of setup. So it reinforces the pattern that then makes the apathy harder to break out of. It becomes harder to mobilize people around any genuine scheme of reform or genuine scheme of change. And over time, the system, such as it is able to keep winning rounds against attempts to reform it, however imperfect or half-hearted or difficult those attempts might have been in the first place.
So talking about the society, what we see is a contradiction is happening in the society. What we see is a rise of the digital media, rise of a class which I don't want to call a politically conscious, but at least there have been a lot of politicization of the young people, either good way or the bad way or the progressive way or the regressive way or whosoever has done it. But I deal myself with the people whose age is from 16, 17 to 24, 25. I'm myself being under 35. So my exposure in the last 5 or 10 years so on the ground level has been that there is a lot has been changing. So how do we see that? On the one side, we see there is a young people, they need hope, they need a sustainability, they need some predictability. And the other side, what we see, as you have rightly mentioned in your articles or in your discussion, that the continuity of the same bureaucratic authoritarianism in the country. So how do you see how the country will navigate in the future, and especially how these young people will navigate in the future given the circumstances?
I think if you look at Pakistan's median age, it is somewhere around 22, 23 years. Roughly, I think it's 22 years and 8 months. And maybe only 7-8% of our population is above 60. So what it means is that most Pakistanis who are alive today would not only have no memory of Ayub Khan or General Zia or maybe even the 1990s, they would have probably become more aware of their political environment somewhere around the middle of the 2010s. So in that sense, Pakistan is a very, very young country. And a lot of the young people, especially in the urban areas, but now increasingly in the rural areas, are also digitally native. I was just seeing this report from the Islamabad Policy Research Institute, and it's astonishing that apparently TikTok has more than 60 million users from Pakistan, which easily makes it by far the most potent platform.
Quite a number.
And on the other hand, platforms like, Facebook or Twitter, those are basically platforms where, old people like me like to hang out. But young people, they prefer Instagram, they prefer Snapchat, they prefer TikTok. And that's where really all the action is. A lot of the content on those platforms is popularly generated, freely shared. There is therefore a lot of communication that takes place, and people follow whoever they like. And you have influencers, you have people on YouTube, you have other such people who have, thousands upon thousands of followers and who can broadcast their views at will. So the kind of gatekeeping, because I remember a time when there was just PTV and the Khabarnama was there. And quite possibly the only honest piece of information on the Khabarnama was the temperature in Srinagar that they showed at the end of it. So the thing is that now that's no longer the case. The question then is that at what point does this translate into a kind of mass political consciousness? At what point does it actually lead to changes in the system that we might think would favor constitutionalism or democracy? The single largest chunk, if you will, of the young population that is politically engaged appears to strongly favor the PTI. And this was also evidenced in the context of the 2024 elections, where in spite of extremely heavy-handed pre-poll and then poll day and then post-poll rigging by the powers that be, the PTI was still able to emerge as the single largest electoral party. So you do see, therefore, that young people got together and found ways in which to subvert the censorship and the restrictions that were imposed on their party of choice. So that's at one level a very good thing. But on the other hand, what you also see is that though they were able to make their point at one level, they were not able to actually force a rollback of the hybrid system. In fact, now it appears that the hybrid system is now transitioning into an overtly authoritarian system. So even the constitutional pretensions are likely to be dropped in the next year or so. So that exercise did not work, or rather it worked, but it was not sufficient to bring about a political recalibration of the country. So it remains to be seen what will be the response when, let's say, there is another electoral exercise in Pakistan in maybe 3 years, 3.5, 4 years' time. That how will the electorate have learned from its experience? And of course, how will the establishment have learned from its experience? Because I think the results that started coming in back in February 2024 also caught the establishment a little bit by surprise, that they thought that they had basically done enough damage to the PTI to neutralize it as a potent political force. But that clearly was not the case. So next time, they might opt for even more heavy-handed things to avert this outcome. So, or given the history of Pakistani politics, next time we might find out that the PTI is back in favor and the current collaborators have been chucked out.
And the bureaucracy will be on the winning side again?
Yes, that's the one consistent factor.
Professor, you have used a few words for bureaucracy in your article, which I would like to call submissiveness, maybe, or a servitude, or internalization of the obedience. Okay, it's fine with the bureaucracy, we understand after reading your article, but what I fear is that the very young people you have just mentioned, I guess people are now internalizing the learned helplessness or this submission, and that is causing serious psychological dissonance in the young minds, especially when they cannot navigate like you the historical dimensions or the understanding, and that might produce a more regressive or more reactionary kind of response from these people in the coming years. And it will further deteriorate the possibility of any sort of constitutionalism and law in this country.
Well, the thing is that the more difficult it is to challenge a system through normal politics and normal political processes, the more attractive extreme ideological responses as a means to fight that system might become. So there is that risk that if the current system keeps going on the way that it is, that a lot of the people who are, let's say, currently supporting the PTI might drift into more extreme opposition movements. So there is always a possibility. But I think when you look at the PTI itself, you see that there is a divide, if you will, between the more pragmatic element of that party that, let's say, wants to keep its government in KP, that is prepared to exercise a kind of a strategic patience with the current system, and the more excitable element in that party, which basically feels that particularly Imran Khan, but also other people who have been victimized by the current dispensation, they need to be released as a price for political normalization. So the thing with Pakistan is that this dynamic can also have the opposite effect, in that there is a reconciliation between the PTI and the establishment. And you see this in Pakistani history, that parties, they start on one side, they go to the other side. After some time in the wilderness, they come back to the side they were originally on. And this circulation is something which every major political party goes through. Those familiar with the PTI itself would point out that the party came into power with the support of the military, and when it had a falling out with its patrons, it was then replaced by the very people against whom the PTI had been mobilized. So there is also that possibility in our context.
So in this, which seems from your discussion, it is likely to be so that Pakistan is going to be trapped in this vicious cycle of power politics and the rule beyond law and the constitution. So I mean, if unfortunately the debate in Pakistan at every level has been polarized, that either everything goes in pro PTI or anti PTI. But what about those people who kind of stand in the middle between these two conflicting and opposing sides?
Okay, so the thing is that you'll first have to define who exactly those people are. And what exactly is their, let's say, electoral or public strength. When you look at the profile of, let's say, urban voters or peri-urban voters in Pakistan, there is broad disaffection, broad dissatisfaction with the conditions that people have to face. When you look at the, let's say, more vocal middle class, educated middle class, upper middle class, they are, at least these days, generally perceived to tilt heavily in favor of the PTI. So the thing is that Pakistan is a very big country. 240 million plus people is no joke. It's also a very diverse country. And no party, however popular it may be, is likely to garner more than 30 to 40% of the total popular vote in any given context. So even in a fair contest, whoever wins needs to be conscious of the fact that while they might have won, there are still 50-60% of the voters who voted for other people. So you should always be conscious of that standing in the context of Pakistani politics. Unfortunately, when our political leaders do win elections or sort of win elections, they seem to forget about the fact that the majority of people did not directly vote for them, and probably they voted for other candidates who lost in that particular context. So I think this is also something which reflects a certain level of political maturity on part of the political leadership, that you have to be conscious of this fact.
Okay, so your long exposure and discussions with the young civil servants in the country. Recently, we have seen, in the past, we have seen, and your work is also linked to the bureaucracy. So the technology is here, and so is our bureaucracy, as in your introductory paragraph of your article also mentions that कि जो चीज़ें पहले were happening in the back door of the whole scenario. अभी वो चीजें are happening on in the social media and even जिसको कहते हैं digital defines of the public. लेकिन यही चीज bureaucracy को भी empower करती है कि they use the social media in order to set an impression governance and in order to cultivate such values that they maintain that aura in the public by using the social, especially the younger officers. So what's your take on that?
I think if you look at social media, what you will of course see is that a lot of civil servants and other public officials post about their daily activities on it. And periodically, something that they post go viral. And normally when it goes viral for the wrong reasons, because it shows, let's say, an element of detachment from reality or a kind of insulation from practical concerns of people that then is very easy to make fun of. Then you also now often have statements that are being made by relatively senior civil servants in front of political leaders, where they are being extremely sycophantic to their face. And while the political leader in question might be enjoying being buttered up in that manner, the social media backlash that then comes from that sort of overt sycophancy and slavishness and servility, that's again not good. Then, of course, there is an added thing that people get to actually see the lifestyle that being an administrative service officer or a police service officer entitles the official to. So when they see the cars and they see the very nice government homes and they see the other benefits that they are getting, it's again something which at one point in time used to be closed off from public view in large measure. So that is also perhaps not good for the public standing of the services. Then when you, let's say, see civil servants tweeting about their enforcement actions, that, you know, when they're going on a, let's say, inspection, or they're going on a raid, or they're going on anything, price checking or whatever, they like to then share that, you know, well, today we checked prices here, today we checked prices there, or other such things. But the collective impact of that doesn't actually seem to be very much. So it's maybe a bit of a, you know, Potemkin's village approach, where you're setting up these micro examples of your activity, but there is no real achievement that is coming from the sum of these activities. So I think that's also something to be considered. And, you know, I mean, one of the things which I often ask civil servants whenever I get a chance to interact with them is, you know, I ask them that, you know, if, let's say, grade 20, 21, 19, whatever officers you might be, that would you be willing to put your own child in the nearest civil government school? Would you be able or willing to seek medical treatment in the general ward of any government hospital? Would you be willing to, you know, drink water from the tap wherever you happen to be? Would you be willing to use public transport? And generally speaking, everybody says no. So here you have a situation where the officers of a state are basically not willing to use any of the services provided for that by that state, because it's not good enough for them or their families. But it is supposed to be good enough for everybody else. So I think that's also something which, it highlights the separation, if you will, between the officer class and everybody else. That in a way they've carved out their own Pakistan, which is very good for them, and they don't really care about the rest of the country, because once you are a part of that elite, the rest of the country just doesn't matter. And the way you get further promotions, the way you get good postings, is by pleasing your boss. Doesn't really matter what people think of you.
I would have a quick question कि आपका जो article है उसमें referring back to the British era, where you have used the word that most of the people were coming recruited in the civil service were coming from the urban higher class or urban upper middle class, but over the time period obviously literacy rate has gone higher, a little bit industrialization has gone higher, so there is a rise of lower middle class in the country. Now everybody, you see in the news that कि ये तंदूर वाले के बेटे ने CSS कर लिया, वो फलां रेडी वाले के बेटे ने CSS कर लिया, जो कि apparently it's obviously appreciated, but once, as you rightly mentioned, that once you are in the power, the very system or the very people or the very society you are coming from, you start kind of hating, or you finding a gap between yourself and the rest of the society. What exactly happens? Is it the training process? Is it the culture they see in the country, or is it their like the institutional training, or what else it can be? Please.
Okay, so it's essentially an upward mobility that results from joining the civil service, or more broadly speaking, the bureaucracy. And depending on where in that structure you are placed, that upward mobility can be very sharp and very intense. And again, once you are an insider, then the system actually does take pretty good care of you. So that difference between you and the rest of the country, that will intensify and get bigger over time. Not only that, but leaving aside the, let's say, logistical benefits, you also have access to people who are important. So you have a lot of social capital that results from simply being a part of this machinery. Even if you are yourself not in a very important position, you have access to people, you have access to places, you can get things done, not just for yourself, but also maybe for your family members or anybody else who you want to help. So that gives you a certain standing. Then there is also the association of having certain credentials and being thought of as better based on those credentials. This isn't a particularly Pakistani problem. This is also a problem you see in Western democracies, where the sort of left has become more of a bourgeoisie left, cut off from the working class, precisely because of more university education, more degrees, more formal credentials. But the idea again basically is that once you have a certain set of professional, educational, other such qualifiers, then you are no longer really a part of that social setup where you might have come from. You are now more a part of the power elite or the decision-making structure of the country. And if you are clever enough, if you're enterprising enough, you can actually prosper greatly in that environment. So, so the dynamic changes.
So, and in the end, any not moral, obviously, but any logical advice for the young people aiming for the civil service, given that the culture of power and governance of Pakistan.
Well, the thing to understand is that going for competitive exams is a very time consuming process. It's a process that will require many years investment. You might not get through most likely on the first attempt or even second attempt. There is a very good chance that even if you do get through, you won't get the service of your choice. So typically when people think of attempting the, let's say, CSS exam, maybe they're thinking about the administrative service or the police service. They're not really thinking about the other services. Those are just there as a sort of backup option that, if you don't get these, then you will go to one of those, because you still have to earn a living. So, if you are a young person, then there is really not much else you can do in our context to have real social mobility staying within Pakistan other than joining the bureaucracy at some level. So compared to nearly any other thing you might think of doing, it is still a better career for you personally. Whether you're in the provincial services or federal, that's a matter of, wherever you can get your foot in the door. But fundamentally, in a sort of producer socialist state like ours, being a member of the state machinery at whatever level confers far more benefits and is therefore highly desirable. So as a rational choice, it is a perfectly reasonable thing to aspire to a career in the civil service. Of course, one can deliver, moral strictures or whatever about integrity and other such things. But I think as a general rule, what happens in our part of the world is that whenever a young officer has idealism and shows resilience in that idealism in the field, then what happens is that after a couple of postings, they will end up being transferred to the secretariat. So you see this in India, you see this in Pakistan, that, you start off your career, you're a assistant commissioner or assistant superintendent of police, you're out in the field. The government officials and your own senior officials, they want you to do various things that are neither legal nor moral. And if you're not prepared to compromise, then after a few years in the field, they'll decide that, well, you're not really suitable for a field assignment. So then you can maybe go to New Delhi and you can go to Islamabad and you can, push paper and sit in meetings and write notes in English for the rest of your life. And that's all right, because you'll also get promoted to the higher levels with the rest of your batch. So I think there should be this understanding of what you are getting into, that if you are ethical under pressure, you will be sent off to somewhere in the state machinery where you can sit at a desk, and if you are willing to help the leadership do the things that the leadership demands of you, regardless of ethical or legal considerations, then the whole country is your playground, and you'll have a very great career in the field.
So that explains actually the word you have used, the kiss up, kick down management model, that uh, uh, apathy and hatred towards the periphery, and the the kissing up to the top, and the who are higher up in the hierarchy. So will this continue so?
Well, I mean, it's from what we can tell, it's been going on since at least 500 BC. If you look at the Arthashastra, so I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. Part of it, of course, is structural, because in any pyramidical structure, even if you have strong ethical and legal restrictions in place, there is a tendency of such structures to look at the top of the pyramid and to imitate or do what the top is likely to reward. So there is that, inbuilt incentive structure in any such organization that concentrates a lot of authority at the top and has people that are subordinate to it. But in our context, the demands that are placed on civil servants are often of an arbitrary nature. And the condition in which to succeed you basically have to reduce yourself is that you have to think of yourself and internalize being the personal servant or the personal retainer of whoever happens to be the boss at any given point in time. So that is, of course, very different from, let's say, a public official in Japan or Germany or the United Kingdom, where hierarchical constraints notwithstanding, there is still a regard for law and propriety in the internal working of the hierarchy. In our context, there is no regard for these two things. So it's essentially an arbitrary behavior, and the ability to fulfill those arbitrary demands is what is most important.
So one can pray that in the end, that may the law and the constitution guide the path of this country. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. I'm deeply humbled and honored to read your work and to talk to you in person. It's a privilege. Thank you so
Thank you so much for
Thank you
having
so
me
much.
on your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.